And I'd like to welcome our next speaker. Owen Cotton-Barratt is a research associate in the Future of Humanity Institute at the University of Oxford, focusing on decisions in the face of great uncertainty. He's an effective altruist, director of the research at the Center for Effective Altruism, and holder of a DPhil in mathematics. Owen will be speaking to us about impact certificates and impact markets, the benefit of markets in altruistic impact, and what's needed to achieve them. Welcome, Owen.
Hi, really happy to be here. So I'm going to talk about impact certificates and impact markets. I think that many of the original ideas here originally trace back to Paul Cristiano, and Dennis Drescher has recently been helping me work out some things. So this is a kind of relatively theory talk about how we could be reconceptualizing impact and how the doing of good things, we relate to that, and what types of things even can be tradable. But I think that there might be a lot of value on the table by getting a good system set up here. So what are we even talking about? Roughly, I'm thinking of impact is managing to change in the supply of a public or maybe private good. There's a couple of modifiers here. If you ask change, what does that's supposed to be changed relative to? The idea is that there's some kind of counterfactual world history where you didn't take a particular action. Mostly, I think that we can not bother too much with this, and we just have this intuitive notion of like, oh, you know, what do we mean by impact? And that'll flow through okay. But I think it's interesting to be able to bottom out what we mean if we need to. And then I also think that I'm regarding it as the responsibility for that change, and that the key notion is that you like do something good, and then the impact flows back to the person responsible. So that's the basic setup, and then maybe the kind of like an interesting question is, well, if this is a thing that belongs to people, often for things that belong to people, we assign people property rights over them. And they can say, oh, well, you know, I want to give this away. I want to assign this to somebody else. And then you can start building markets on top of that. And we can ask the question for impact, as we've defined it here, should we be able to give assignation rights and have people say, actually, this impact which was coming to me, I am passing on to another party. And if we do, then that could be the first step towards allowing markets in impact. Like impact as this slightly reified abstract notion. And I think that there are several possible benefits of having markets, and they're kind of the usual benefits, but transferred over to a new context. I think that several of these benefits we can get through mechanisms which don't make any reference to like reified impact. Like I think that I've put here as the first benefit, ex post evaluation of charitable work or other work that's aiming to be good, and prizes are a normal way of doing that. But I think that the reconceptualization can help to spot places where we can port over other market mechanisms, and there can be something useful about it. So yeah, the normal story for why ex post evaluation is better is that you have more information. Like you just get to see more. Oh, did that turn out well? Versus if you're restricted to funding things beforehand, then you have to go on the basis of, do people have a plausible story? And private information is like bites harder in that case. I think that, yeah, so this can allow for better integration of diffuse information, where somewhere before kind of a final price for some set, the marketplace allow whichever individuals have pertinent information as to the eventual value of something to get that information into the market by buying or selling, and the markets can be a good way of integrating that information. And then I think another potentially big deal is that it can incentivize excellence. If you have a system where markets can give big rewards to people who do things that are really good, then it incentivizes people to look for, hey, how could we do something that's great? And I think that just humans are often incentivized by things like getting recognition, but also getting rich. And there's a lot of energy that goes into oh, how can we make a for-profit company that's going to make us rich? And I think that if we could get that same innovation and energy going into how can we do things where a for-profit model doesn't work, but we still want to be really ambitious and aim for big changes in the world, then this is something where markets and impact can be pretty helpful. So the basic conceit, which I'm going to illustrate through a metaphor here. And so the idea is, like, rather than just accepting the impact from a good action that you've done, and you in this case could be a person, or it could be an organization, or maybe it can be some other kind of entity, but you like intercept with a bottle, and you say, no, I'm not taking the impact for this. Instead, I'm going to put it into storage, and now it's a transferable unit which I can go and sell. Yeah, so you can think of this like an NFT for a particular good deed that has been done. And the metaphor with the bottles, the key step here is that owners can later open the bottle, kind of meaning that now whoever gets to drink it or whatever gets the impact that was originally bottled. And so if you have tokens, then at this point they would become untradeable. They would record who was attributed the associated impact. And maybe if people often think of NFTs as like a market in fine art, this might be thought of more like a market in fine wine. Ultimately, the value of the things is propped up by people wanting to consume them at some future point. So that's the basic idea. And then there's lots of reasons why this is pretty hard to get set up. One is that impact attribution is often implicit and it's complicated. You have a thing which a bunch of people have collaborated on, and it's just not clear who gets which amount of credit, and it's a mess to try and sort out. And that means that it's a mess for anybody to try and sell the associated impact, because the buyers don't really know what they're getting. I also think that right now we don't have good ways of recording anything there. And like the recording thing is we can deal with. And then finally, you know, nobody cares. We don't have people who are saying, oh yeah, I really want to buy into these impact markets. There isn't the demand for it. So one other concept is I want to draw a distinction between impact certificates, which are the things I was representing by bottles, tokens denoting the rights to attribute the impact associated with some particular specified actions, and impact shares, which entitle the owners to a share of future stream of impact certificates from whatever the owned entity is. I mean, impact shares are just kind of shares, but in the impact context. I just wanted to draw this distinction because I think that sometimes when I've heard people talking about ideas here, the two can be blurred, and I think that conceptually they're distinct, conceptually they're both useful, and I expect that if we ever do get to the point where we're building mature ecosystems around these, we will be using both. So what would be needed to set up impact markets? I think there's maybe three central things. There's bookkeeping. We want some way of recording, okay, who owns the impact associated with particular actions, such that people can trust however that bookkeeping process is done. I think that kind of connected to the bookkeeping is you want some basic way to validate that the records of the things that are being written down line up with real world impact that they are supposed to represent. You don't want somebody just claiming, hey, I did this amazing thing when and getting paid for it when it's kind of essentially just fraudulent. I think that the second is needing social buy-in. You need buy-in from lots of different parties. You want buy-in from whichever bodies are potentially doing the good deeds, which would be bottled and issued as certificates. You need buy-in from marketplaces to facilitate the purchase of these. But I think, and maybe buy-in from, if you want to get benefits of speculators and markets, you maybe want the buy-ins from speculators. But I think that the key thing is from the ultimate buyers, those people who are have an interest in eventually consuming the bottled impact. And so here I might think of this as substituting in for when people currently give money to charities or other good causes, and saying, well, hey, maybe they would prefer to buy impact. If you're giving money to a charity, I think that the social contract is such that implicitly you are buying some impact from the charity. You're saying, well, I want to give this money because I trust that it will be used for good things. And this is saying, well, there's a different setup where you could still buy the good deeds, but you get to find out exactly what you've bought rather than doing it all on trust that something good will happen. Also, if these things get implemented legally, I think that the point of consumption of the certificate should be tax deductible. There's a bunch of questions of how you can actually set that up, but that's the stage which is very tightly analogous to making donations. And then there's a bunch of infrastructure that one would want to have in a mature ecosystem helping to support this. I think maybe the most key elements here are the ones, 3 certificate auditors. You want some bodies which do the work of investigating certificates to check out and say, hey, yeah, this is legit. The thing which it is claiming happened really did happen. Because if that is left to each individual buyer to do, then that presents a massive amount of overhead on the market and is likely to make purchasers unwilling to enter. And maybe you also early on want to have certificate issuers which help to facilitate that process. It's also possible that you could set it up in such a way that people self-issue. You might want to combine 3 and 4 here. You might want to have some relatively trusted bodies which arise as, hey, we will issue certificates and we will develop a reputation which people will get trust in, that we do a good job of auditing the things that we issue certificates for, and therefore any certificate issued by us can be trusted. But that could also just live as a layer on top of this. I'm imagining that a mature market would have competition between multiple different auditors and trying to audit things efficiently without spending too much resources, but also to a high enough standard that it establishes a high degree of trust. And then there's a question of, okay, well, if we would eventually need all of these things, what is the critical path towards setting up markets here? And of the 3, bookkeeping, social buy-in, and infrastructure, I really think that social buy-in is the key aspect. We want people using this, and then that will, the more that there's demand and people using it, the more that will drive everything else being built to meet that demand. But I think that bookkeeping and some aspects of infrastructure are helpful for facilitating that social buy-in. If there's a clean implementation, if people feel like, oh yeah, okay, it's very obvious what's happening, and I feel trust in the technical way that this has been set up, then that can facilitate the social buy-in. But I don't think that it's the only part of social buy-in which matters. I outlined earlier why I am excited about impact markets, what I think that the big upsides here are. I also think that there are a number of potential downsides, and I'm just going to highlight a handful which seem to me like the biggest issues. One is that at least on a naive implementation of this, impact markets could incentivize likely harmful charities. And the reason is that there's an asymmetry where if a charity does a bunch of work, I mean, sorry, I'm saying charity, but it could just be actions which somebody is doing where they're hoping to make money by selling the impact. Yeah, if somebody does something that's very risky and that there's some chance of getting extremely bad outcomes and some chance of getting extremely good outcomes, the value of the associated certificates is generally capped below by 0. It's, you know, 0 is what you get if nobody in the market is willing to pay for this. And this could mean that if there's a high tail upside, that people are incentivized to take those actions, even if the expected value of the thing is strongly negative. Now, this isn't a problem which is unique to impact markets. In general, it's a question of negative externalities, and there's a question of how society should coordinate to try to tax negative externalities or otherwise incentivize people to not create them. But I do think that it can bite, that the issue can bite particularly cleanly here, and so it's worth some extra attention. Yeah, it's worth pointing out that you might think, well, markets generally let people send a price signal that they think something is overvalued by shorting a stock. But because the eventual resolution here can't go below 0, that doesn't provide a direct way for markets to say that they think that something is actually strongly net negative. So this could be worked on, and maybe there are some interesting, innovative solutions which could work here. This could be regarded as, yeah, Paul Cristiano pointed this out to me, part of the general problem that impact markets, as we're currently conceiving them, don't solve the problem of moral trade, where you, meaning that you fail to reach Pareto superior outcomes, which everybody would prefer, because they're nobody's kind of first preferred option via trade. I think that there's also issues about changing the incentives otherwise on people pursuing good work, and it might push people towards things which are easier to turn into impact that can be sold, or easier to or to put more work into marketing and explaining why this thing that you did in the past was really good. Of course, this is to some extent a duel of issues which already come up for charities, where they can be incentivized to pursue work that they think will sell well, and that they'll be able to persuade people to give them money to do rather than for having done, and to put a lot of money into fundraising for their future work. So there are traps there. It's not I don't have a particular reason to think that they are larger than the current issues, but could be worth further investigation. And in general, there's a kind of like hesitance of, well, this could be a large shake-up in how charitable work is funded. And some people have been thinking about that some, but we definitely haven't worked through all of the implications of that. And maybe there are unknown effects of how it affects of the impacts on the ecosystem of moving to this system. So this one makes me particularly interested in experiments which have some ability to say, okay, no, let's close up shop. This seems like it's not going in a productive direction. But there are complications of how that interacts with incentivizing trust from people. Okay, and so then in the last part of the talk, I want to talk about what we're calling Verici 0.1. The numbering system and name is to suggest that this really is kind of early stage thinking. And the idea here is that if we want functional markets and we want people having a lot of trust in those markets, I think that depends on people having a good understanding of how the markets work. And if I go and I try to buy a stock on an exchange, I don't need to have gone and looked into all of the legal contracts that are supporting the particular type of stock that I am buying, and to check. I can just have like some generalized trust in the exchange, and that the thing is regulated in some way which stops them selling 50 times as much stock as actually exists, etc. And I think that there are other ways. Well, if we just set up common expectations of how things are going to work, that could be pretty helpful. And so this is my current best guess for the social norms that we should try to set up as the rules of markets, impact markets, if we were doing experiments today to establish impact markets. And you know, I'm sure there'll be mistakes in here, but I really think it is worth trying to, if we're making attempts, to start with our best guesses. And so there are a few different properties here. The first is verifiability, that impact has occurred. I think that it is helpful if there is gatekeeping around the market, which makes it clear to market entrants that things which are on sale there have passed some level of auditing, that they really happened. I think that it's also really important to have clear ownership of rights, and not to try and sell impact in cases where there's too much ambiguity over ownership rights. I think that we want some kind of consumption mechanism, this equivalent of unbottling the impact, treating it like fine wine rather than fine art. And I think that we want to set things up in such a way that they are incremental, and that this is acceptable to existing interests in the markets. And so I'm now going to say a bit more about each of these four. And yeah, they don't yet address most of the risks I mentioned before. These are more rules where I think creating common knowledge around this would help give the best shot of creating healthy markets, which a lot of people are actually happy buying into. Yeah, I mean, the basic issue with verifiability is that it's hard to facilitate trust from buyers if people can't verify whether the impact has happened. As a matter of UI and making the process relatively seamless for buyers, I think it's helpful if there is some relatively trusted zone where they can operate in, and they can say, well, now I'm just going to look at what the things are claiming, rather than thinking, anytime I need to make a purchase here, I need to go and do a massive amount of due diligence. And there are various different ways that this could be set up. It could be that one has a marketplace and one accredits various different auditors, and then buyers coming in can do filters on, hey, I only want to see things which have been approved by this kind of auditor. Yeah, so the issue of rights, I think, is interesting. I think that there are lots of cases where, say, I work on a project with someone, and then we say, and then we're like, oh, well, that did well, and now I want to go and sell the impact for my work on this. This can create adversarial dynamics and incentives between the people who were the collaborators, because now they're each incentivized to produce a public narrative for why their contributions were particularly important and other people's contributions were relatively unimportant. And I think that that could be pretty unhealthy and destructive. And so I think that we want to avoid having that. And often I think that the way to do this will be via explicit agreements among collaborators about how impact will be shared, similar to the advice for startup founders to agree a share of equity very early on in the process. So society has to grapple with this in various cases, and there are a bunch of situations where ownership already ends up pretty clear, and like society has allocated a standard answer to this. If somebody owns a company 100%, then presumably they own all of the impact certificates that company is generating. Similarly for copyright, and if there is impact associated coming from the copyrighted material, by default, I think that should go to the copyright owner. I think that one can specify clear, explicit divisions, and in general, if you're doing something by yourself, it's pretty simple. Relatively unclear cases include donating to a charity, and so a challenge for getting impact markets off the ground is that I think that right now charities often couldn't, in good faith, issue certificates of impact because there is significant ambiguity as to how much the rights for the good deeds that they have done lies with the charity rather than the donors to the charity. If they have some kind of explicit expectation setting with the donors, then I think one can clear that up. I think you get a similar thing with people who are employed by a charity, where I think that there's an implicit social contract that they are doing that in part because they regard their work as contributing to the good that the charity is doing, but I think it's ambiguous as to how big their contribution is. And just lots of other activities where there's a collaboration, but there's been no explicit discussion about division of credit. Then consumption, I was pointing to earlier. I think that this has a couple of different benefits. One is that it helps to provide social proof that there are ultimate buyers interested, and these buyers are in fact removing tokens from circulation. And so I think that this should support trust in underlying value of tokens, because it builds up a track record and lessen fears of bubbles. I also think that it helps with the final property of being incremental, because it provides continuity with the current practice. In the current practice, implicitly, when somebody is doing something good, they're just consuming the impact immediately. And this is saying, hey, there's another operation that they could take where they say, no, we're going to hold off on that and bottle it and put it into a certificate, and then maybe that can be sold. But if they don't do that, we're just in the status quo world. And I think that continuity is helpful, because if you imagined something without a property like this, then there could be a bunch of people saying, hey, does this impact markets thing mean that now lots of charities need to be paid again for the work they did? Didn't we already give them money for that ahead of time? And I think that could create bad feeling and could make parties who, like the parties who would be giving money here, somewhat disinclined to engage with the process for fear of being exploited. Yeah, so this is the basic principle behind incremental. I think that at every stage we want to set things up so that there's just incentives for people to come in and start using this, and that nobody is directly losing out as a result, in order to avoid creating kind of entrenched opposition to the system. I think that this can be totally, I think this is totally achievable, and I think that it's normally the good pathway to go for if you want a new economic technology to take over. Okay, so I'll wrap up there, just to and then we can take a few questions. And the final comment is this: yeah, I'm kind of hopeful that impact markets could be a big thing and could transform how a lot of analysis is done and a lot of incentives in the ecosystem of people trying to do good things. And I'm really interested to see how they develop. And I think that this kind of conference is great because the people at conferences like this are exactly the right people to be going and building experiments.
Well, thanks, Owen, for a comprehensive look at markets and altruistic impact that acknowledges the risks as well as the upsides. And we have some time for questions, and I know there are a few in the chat. If you don't mind, I'll surface them here. The first question is from actually another one of our forthcoming presenters, Andrew Critch. And he asks, Owen, I know you've thought about Shapley value to reward counterfactual impacts, like making a good attempt that falls short of someone else's. I think having people engage in public discourse about Shapley value attributions could really help reward people who almost made it and thereby incentivize more attempts to do good. Could you comment on whether something like that seems good or what challenges it would raise?
I think that the main challenge that I'm worried about is this thing that I alluded to about trying to sell impact when there's unclear ownership of the rights. I think that it could create adversarial incentives for people to overstate their contributions and understate those of others. However, I see like the prize that you're pointing at, and I think maybe there could be something good there. I feel more like, oh, this is worth more thought, not I know how to make this work. I'm in the moment mildly pessimistic about getting it to work in a straightforward way, but there are lots of possibly more complex implementations which might dodge many or all of the issues.
Owen, do you think bottling and consuming is required to make impact certificates work? Why can't consumption be a time bandwidth oriented, i.e. the current holder of the certificate, like with art markets?
I think that this is a pretty significant bifurcation in how you want to conceive of and set up impact markets. I think that the world where you say, you treat it like the art markets and you say the current holder is deriving value makes some sense, but it loses significant amounts of cleanness relative to the one where it which has consumption, and I think it may lose significant amounts of the benefit. So some of the cleanness that it loses is you can no longer just look at something and say, oh, how good was this as a way of informing how much you should care about buying it. You sort of want to look at, well, how much of the value has already depreciated, and you're going to be baking in some expectations of, well, how much society seems to care about this thing, but it reduces the ability to say, well, we want to use this as a kind of like consequentialist mechanism. I think that it also probably makes it significantly harder to set up in a way that gives you anything like tax deductibility for buying these things. I think that from my understandings of like the principles of how tax deductibility is supposed to work, not anchored on the laws of any one country. The idea is when you give money to a thing for which you do not receive like material benefit, that's the point at which you should be given the tax deduction. And I think that the fine art model of impact certificates never has such a moment, and therefore it is hard to work out how the tax deduction should work. I think that the version with consumption does have such a moment, and that's better. And then I also think that the fine art model makes it harder to incentivize profit-motivated speculators and analysts to enter into the market, because in this model, you expect by default most certificates to depreciate with time. Maybe there'll be some which go up in value because people just realize how great the thing was, and so you can still get some of this, but essentially there will be a significant tax on anyone who is trying to enter into this from the perspective of, well, I'm not going to be the person ultimately like buying these and wanting to hold the impact, but I can add good information to the system, and I can earn a profit for doing that, and so I'll come and help things out. And those people are just a bit more pushed out of the system, which means that I expect to get less of the benefits of relatively efficient markets out of that. All of that said, you totally can do a version without consumption. There's also the issue of maybe you're more likely to just get bubbles in the version without consumption because there's nothing propping up the price of things. But the original proposal for certificates of impact by Paul Cristiano and Katja Grace didn't have consumption. I feel less optimistic about it doing really good things, but maybe I'm wrong.
Owen, do you know of anyone building the market you described? Are you planning to? And what support would be most helpful?
I am personally not planning to, but I know Dennis Drescher, who helps me with some of the thinking about the Verici standards, has been thinking about what would be needed to get a fairly minimal implementation of this set up on top of NFTs in some existing chains. Actually, I haven't touched base with him recently enough to know what the current status of that is. I think maybe we were thinking, oh, we should publish the blog post on Verici, and we haven't quite got that.
Great. Well, we would love to keep apprised of this research, and there's some excitement in the chat about this idea. And I'd like to thank Owen again for his time.